Dana, hi. Thank you for taking the time to talk about your new audiobook, The Perennial Philosophy Reloaded.
My great pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
For those who may not be familiar with perennial philosophy in general, could you maybe help us by summarizing some of the key tenets or core ideas?
Sure. Uh, it's basically a family of theories surrounding a very specific type of mystical experience. So, long ago in 1945, Aldous Huxley read very deeply in the world's mystical traditions, and he noticed a thread running across them. And that was something that he saw as the unitive mystical experience. In other words, um, these mystics would talk about a feeling of oneness with all reality, or a feeling that they had merged with God, or a feeling that somehow all of nature was not only interconnected, but really just one thing of which they had become part of. And so these unitive type mystical experiences, Huxley called the unitive knowledge because he believed a kind of truth was coming through in these experiences of our oneness with reality. So the perennial philosophy developed after Huxley. There were a bunch of theorists, Alan Watts, Francis Vaughan, the transpersonal psychologist, Stanislav Grof, Ram Dass, many names that people would recognize, Ken Wilber, today Father Richard Rohr, Rami Shapiro, I can go on and on. But there are nuances in the way different perennial philosophers interpret the unitive mystical experience. But all perennial philosophers believe that this fundamental experience of our connection with all of reality is not only something like fun, but it has tremendous value. In fact, Huxley described it as our planet's greatest unused natural resource because he believed very firmly that if human beings would wake up into higher states of consciousness, and that's what's triggered by this unitive experience, that would give our planet the best chance for survival, basically. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Thank you. Could you comment on the often used distinction between religious and spiritual?
Yeah, I mean, there are many ways to do that, I think. An old way of explaining it in some ways is that priests speak and mystics listen. So priests speak to God, mystics listen to God, mystics listen to the sacred. So their experience of religion, quote unquote, is experience based. And a way that Houston Smith, one of the most famous of all perennial philosophers, described the separation is he said there's um, an exoteric level of religion, which has to do with liturgy, ritual, architecture, art, prayer, congregation. These are the exterior level of religion, but there is an esoteric level of religion, and that is what the mystical traditions are dealing with, an inner aspect of religion. And in the perennial philosophy today, it's important to point out that many theorists say that esoteric level of religion transcends religion as formally thought of, that there are a lot of mystics today who actually don't participate in an organized religion.
I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about your background and what, quote unquote, qualifies you as an expert on this topic.
Yeah. Well, I had read the Perennial Philosophy back when I was in college, and it was a seminal book for me. I mean, it was a book that profoundly influenced the way that I saw the world. Uh, I can't I can't say enough about that. But Then that segued into a deep interest in Hinduism and Buddhism for me. So I spent 7 years in graduate school uh, studying Hinduism and Buddhism primarily, but also other world's religions. And then as I went on to become a professor um, for 30 years at the Maine College of Art and Design, there were certain thinkers and certain philosophers that in my classes, students would come up after class and say, "Hey, who was that person that said such and so?" And I noticed how often Aldous Huxley was somebody that students would come up and ask about. So about 25 years ago, I began reading biographies of Aldous Huxley, and I realized that there were only two or three, and they had completely glossed his spiritual interests. They had really glossed his understanding of the perennial philosophy. In a couple of cases, they actually didn't understand what he said. And they also glossed his writings on psychedelics, which I found interesting. And I predict he interpreted his psychedelic experience through his perennial philosophy. So I feel that since they didn't understand the perennial philosophy, they didn't even bother dealing with the psychedelics as anything more than an anomaly. Though in fact, his experiences with psychedelics and the perennial philosophy were what mattered most to Aldous Huxley during the last periods of his life. So, with that in mind, I ended up writing a biography of Aldous Huxley that focused specifically on his philosophical development. And that led me to think very deeply about other perennialists and become interested in comparative mysticism. So I ended up writing the authorized biography of Houston Smith, for example, and so yeah, for now more than 20 years, theories of the perennial philosophy have really engaged me.
You have posited, or you wrote somewhere, the perennial philosophy is also not a philosophy in the usual sense of the term. Would you like to explain that a little bit more?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's first of all, philosophy means love of wisdom, literally love of wisdom. So all perennial philosophers are great lovers of wisdom. But not all perennial philosophers approach their descriptions of the position in a systematic way. They're not trying to speculate about the nature of reality and then build up a logical system of arguments in support of a position. Uh, Perennial philosophers like Ramdas, for instance, are really trying to go deeply into this unitive mystical experience and simply describe what they're experiencing. So they're not speculating about what reality might be. They're experiencing reality and then trying to give a play-by-play report of what that experience, how that experience makes the most sense to them in human language. So that's what I mean is that there are perennial philosophers who simply are trying to describe their unitive experiences.
So you devote a lot of care to categorizing the many varieties of a one perennial philosophy. Maybe a provocative question. Is there a center there? And if so, in what context or perhaps relative to what is perennial philosophy most useful as a super category?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. One of the things that bothered me, and I wrote some professional academic articles about it, was looking over work that had been done on the perennial philosophy, not only by perennial philosophers, but by detractors of the position, in this case specifically, is that they would have a tendency to take one particular perennial philosopher and then try to make the claim that that perspective goes for all the others. And in fact, that's not true, that it's a range of perspectives and they don't hold the same exact position. So they all surround this unitive mystical experience, but they have different nuances in their interpretation of it. For example, in terms of the relevance of religion, Aldous Huxley was very almost dogmatically anti-dogma. And so he wasn't very religion friendly. And then there are people like Houston Smith who believe that the religion's mystical traditions contain some of the most tried and true pathways up the mountain of awakening. So, you get a range of interpretations there. Now, uh, in terms of a core, philosophically speaking, interpretively speaking, besides simply that unitive mystical experiences occur, however occasioned, there are certain ideas that this family of theories tends to hold in common. So, for instance, most perennial philosophers hold the position that consciousness is a variable. It's not a case of human consciousness that is analogous to a light switch like the one on the wall behind me, where consciousness is on, consciousness is off. I wake up in the morning, I'm awake. I go to sleep at night, the switch goes off. The idea that consciousness is a variable and that some people are more awake than other people, and specifically inside the perennial philosophy, more awake to this experience of union with all reality. So, in Buddhism, the Buddha is called the Buddha. That wasn't his name. His name wasn't, Larry Buddha. The Buddha means the awakened one. So, from the Sanskrit verb root bud, to awaken. So, this idea that consciousness isn't like an on-off switch, but more like a dimmer switch. Some people's consciousness is on, but other people's consciousness is up. More of this unitive quality is coming through. And that's common to perennial philosophers, that belief. Most perennial philosophers also believe that consciousness exceeds the brain, that the brain is not a machine, if you will, that creates consciousness, but rather a machine that localizes consciousness. That consciousness is ubiquitous, it's everywhere. And like a radio turning in a signal, the brain is an instrument that localizes it, canalizes it. So most perennial philosophers hold that view. And, I could give you the laundry list. In the book I list, I think it's 10 or 12 common features of this family resemblance. And not all perennial philosophers will believe in all aspects of the laundry list, but just like members of an actual family, some family members hold a stronger general family resemblance than others. Oh, you have dad's nose, I have mom's eyes. That's true of this family of theories also.
Is perennial philosophy perhaps even more relevant today than it was in the past?
Oh, profoundly, profoundly, profoundly relevant. If you read the work of Father Richard Rohr or Rabbi Rami Shapiro or Mirabai Starr, Andrew Harvey, and others, they all make the claim that when you realize your oneness with everything experientially, then identity changes. You stop relating to life as what Alan Watts called a skin encapsulated ego, just locked up in your own individuality and your own individual interests. Now, with this identity with all reality, um, one feels a kinship with all things. The suffering of others is your suffering too, because in this perspective of consciousness as ubiquitous, there's the view that all of us, all beings, all living things, are the same one consciousness looking out through myriad sets of eyes. And so when your identity transcends that localized experience of self, then one wants to help. One wants to come back from that experience and help all those others that are part of oneself. I hope that comes across. But you see it in the work of Richard Rohr, focuses on the LGBT community and the suffering that they've had over the years. Mirabai Starr lost a 17-year-old daughter in a car accident. So she deals with those who are grieving, and how unitive experiences can help them with their healing, but also how grieving itself, if approached correctly, can trigger unitive experiences. On a basic level, by realizing your suffering is not the only suffering going on in the world. So, yeah, much to say there, but some people doing some very beautiful work, because otherwise, unitive mystical experiences would only be some flashy experience that you had of very little use, perhaps. But Houston Smith used to say that traits matter more than states. And what he meant by that was flashy states of consciousness or expanded states of consciousness really find their true value in the everyday world when they trigger improved traits of behavior. One way to know if you're growing spiritually and if you're having genuine unitive experiences is, are you becoming kinder? Are you listening more? Are you more patient, uh, more calm? So there are definite characteristics. If you're caring about the world more and acting with more compassion. This is true in Tibetan Buddhism also. The Dalai Lama is always saying, compassion is the proof of wisdom. And this holds true in the perennial philosophy.
Dana, do you see a perennialism having a role in our awakening to our interconnectedness on a planetary level?
Definitely, definitely. We have so much pressure on us today. I used to teach an environmental ethics course where I'd ask my students, what do you see as the challenges that we're up against as a species? And I would get the usual list of problems, right? Overpopulation, pollution, uh, loss of habitat. You're familiar with the laundry list. So I would get these all written on the board, and then I would make an argument that's common to perennial philosophy, which is none of those are the problems. They're the byproducts of a problem. And the problem is our worldview. So the way we see all actions and thoughts spin out of a culture's way of looking at the world around it. And so many of our problems today, all the dominant problems, are really byproducts of a worldview that's antiquated and isn't serving us well anymore. And that is that we're the crown of creation, we're the only important species, we are unique, we're all that matters. The world is a series of resources for us. Those who cut down the trees and dig up the soil are developers because they're taking useless nature and making it something useful for us. I get up on my high horse about this, but you get the point. And so only a new seed yields a new crop. And what I mean by that is only a new worldview is going to be a platform for more integrated, more holistic behavior. So, how could an experience of our oneness with nature, our oneness with each other and all other species, be anything but wonderful as an experiential platform for building a new integrated worldview? And when I look at the worldview that we have now, a materialist worldview, and I don't only mean that in terms of consumer culture, but in this reductionism of only things I can see and touch and own have value. And it's not serving us. And a lot of young people realize it's not serving us. And so they're turning to the kind of everyday cynicism you were referring to, where they feel like it's a hopeless situation. There's no way out of this dilemma. Uh, and that's very sad, because if you build into your own individual worldview a defeatist perspective that everything's been tried and nothing worked, and why keep trying, then you don't keep trying, and you don't try to shake yourself awake. And, what a lot of people today in my field, Jeffrey Kripal comes to mind, a brilliant scholar at Rice University, is that we desperately need to craft a new worldview. And I see the perennial philosophy as so integral to that. You know, people all the time are having experiences where, wow, I was climbing up on a mountain one day and I felt like I was all powerful standing on that peak. And at the same time, I felt like I was totally insignificant. And they'll come back to I was walking on the beach and I felt like this timelessness. And from a perennial philosophy perspective, what they're actually experiencing in those moments is the timelessness of consciousness and being itself looming into their purview. So that aspect of one's own mind that transcends their individuality is coming to the fore. And those experiences, as I said earlier, in terms of applying them to helping the world around us, are beautiful.
I think your answer leads to another question, which is, do you see indigenous cosmologies or worldviews having a role to play, or how are they related to perennial philosophy?
Well, I'm not an expert on indigenous religions, if you mean by that Native American religions or Native African religions. Um, but if we look at religions like Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Taoism to a large extent, these are religions that were heavily invested in mystical experience and cultivating techniques like the yogas, like meditation, pranayama, etc., for cultivating these experiences of transcendence and oneness. So those traditions, um, Stanislav Grof, a key perennial philosopher, when he was exploring methods for triggering these deep unitive experiences, he realized at some point, wow, we don't need to completely reinvent the wheel, that a lot of cultures have been doing just that. And in indigenous American communities, of course, uh, they had their own techniques. The Native American church, with its sacramental use of peyote, for instance, is a very good uh, example of using the peyote not to get high, not recreationally, but recreationally, right? Same spelling, very different meaning. To recreate the person in a more expanded and more unitive form.
So, if we could go a little bit more into this, so the Perennial Philosophy Reloaded discusses two kinds of unitive mystical experiences, UMEs as you call them in the audiobook. Could you explain a little bit more about these two types of UMEs, what they are, maybe why they're such an important focus?
Yeah. That's also a really good question. So there are lots of, if we define the term very broadly, mystical, if we define it broadly, and people generally do, quite frankly, then lots of things get listed under that heading. For instance, psi phenomenon like telepathy and precognition and telekinesis and these kind of psi phenomena, but also mystical experiences like a sense of profound presence. Like I felt like there was a non visible being around me, or an encounter like Moses' experience of the burning bush, perhaps. So there are different kinds of mystical experiences that people have. But when Huxley was reading in the mystical traditions, then he posited the unitive mystical experience as the highest common factor. So what he was saying is there are lots of different kinds of mystical experiences, and there are even different ones in different traditions. But the thread that he saw running across was that a lot of mystics were placing a premium on this experience of oneness with all reality. And for Huxley, he felt like, oh, what if I could read minds? That would be an interesting parlor trick. It would be useful in Las Vegas, but it might actually, in the spiritual sense, do more harm than good, because I would start to build up my ego thinking, oh, I'm a person who can read minds, or I'm a person who can predict the future, or something like that. So he saw the unitive experience as something that transcends the ego and reduces the ego in ways that are extremely beneficial. We're very aware of ourselves as Dana or Carlos, but we get so wrapped up in our everyday life as Dana and Carlos that we don't tune in as much as we should to that aspect of what we are that transcends our individuality. So Huxley said the general message of the mystics was that was the highest common factor that should be cultivated. And so that was the mystical experience that, became the kernel of the perennial philosophy.
To follow through on that, you've described noetic experiences as being non-rational rather than irrational. Do you think you could help us unpack what that means?
Well, first of all, so the experience is experiential, right? Then what happens with mystics very often is that they have this experience that they are so excited to share with others, and they come down off the mountain, they come away from their cave or mowing their lawn, whatever the mystic is doing at that particular moment, and they can't wait to talk about it, but they find it very difficult to fit into words. So it's very common as a phenomenological characteristic of mystical experience to say that it's ineffable. I can't describe it. It's beyond words, right? And yet they go on talking about it for a very long time. Or in many cases, they go on talking about it in poetry because they find poetry better able to convey what they experience. Rumi is a very good example of that. Teresa of Avila also wrote poetry. Many mystics have. So poetry can be very useful for making these descriptions. But the core of the issue is uh, even if you can give a very good rational description of this transpersonal experience, and that's what I try to do in the book, right? I'm a philosopher, had a whole career as a philosopher, publishing professional work. I'm trying to give a rational description of what transcends the rational mind, that the rational description isn't it. In the same way that a recipe of a cake isn't a cake, then the description of it isn't the experience itself. And so that non-rational experience is what perennial philosophers put a premium on. Okay, don't sit at home and read travel books about Paris. Go to Paris, but at the same time, having been there, and when you want to describe it, maybe you'll excite some others to take the trip. Come on over to Paris.
So your thorough answer and pretty much anticipated my next question, but except maybe I'll just add a Rumi quote that I was going to share, where he says something like, "You have to keep breaking your heart until it opens."
Rumi, when he would try to describe that consciousness transcends the brain, and that consciousness at a cosmic scale is at the root of all of our individual experiences of consciousness. The way that one ocean rises up into myriad individual waves, and the waves think they're separate from each other. But Rumi says, you're not a drop in the ocean. You're the entire ocean in a drop. And when you're having that experientially, your ocean side, so to speak, looming forward, it reorients you to the world in a profound way. I always say it's analogous to what astronauts returning from space, called the overview effect. That when they saw the entire planet from outer space, all their other experiences when they got home were set inside that context. And when you experience your oceanness, it's not something that you can just deny or neglect or let go of. You feel a profound connection to the world. So you have a new perspective on each of your daily experiences. And that's what excites all perennial philosophers, including Rumi.
So you mentioned that perennial philosophy was popular in the 60s and 70s. And I think that Huxley's book was written in the mid 50s, right? Or maybe I'm getting that slightly wrong.
1945.
Oh, right. So it was 1945. That's right. So a few years later than that. And then there was a little bit of waning heading into the 80s and so forth. And I'm wondering if you'd like to comment on why you think there was a waning during this subsequent, generation, really.
Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot to say there, Carlos, because in my generation, the '60s generation, then Huxley in 1953, this might be what you were thinking of, wrote a book called The Doors of Perception. And in that book, Huxley makes the case, based on an experience that he himself had, that psychedelics can trigger these unitive mystical experiences, and that those experiences have tremendous value. So, fast forward 10 years, basically what happened was a lot of psychologists, philosophers embraced this view of Huxley and were using psychedelics in their work not as, again, recreation, but as recreation. And so Alan Watts wrote The Joyous Cosmology. Actually, all of the early perennial philosophers that I mentioned earlier, Stan Groff, etc., Francis Vaughan, Houston Smith, also experimented with psychedelics and saw value in them. So when the clampdown on psychedelics happened in 1970, then the fewer and fewer people had access. Uh, the boomer generation of that time, the small amount of them that were in the counterculture and had tried psychedelics out, maybe drifted away from spiritual exploration, if you will. But in the 1980s, also, there was a group of scholars who were very rabidly against any theory of the perennial philosophy. There were postmodernists who believed that differences matter more than similarities between cultures. So they were disdainful of the perennial philosophy. Uh, there were protectionists of religions that felt like, oh, I don't want there to be a thread running across the religions. My religion has the best perspective. And they were trying to shout down perennialism. So there were lots of different factors that led to a waning. But as I say in the book, the waning was only public. It wasn't a true waning. It just kind of went underground. Not underground in a criminal kind of sense, but underground in the sense that there were lots of other people who kept writing, and lots of people who kept reading, but the perennial philosophy didn't have the public profile it had enjoyed in the late 60s and the early 70s. So that's part of the reason for this book, is to explain that perennialism continued and that there were perennialist philosophers doing really substantial work. So to bring that to the public's attention is one of my goals.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about this resurgence that you've seen yourself, and why now might be the right time to revisit and reload this philosophical framework.
Well, part of it most definitely is a dissatisfaction with the status quo. A dissatisfaction with the status quo for lots of reasons. The status quo worldview, which places such a premium on uh, me at the worst level, the most superficial level of what I am. What can I own now? Uh, Let me own more. And even though owning doesn't seem to make me happy, maybe I just don't own enough. I got to get more of that. And people have become dissatisfied. And plus, ideologically, as religion has been waning in our culture, there's been a meaning deficit. People are looking for meaning, looking for hope. and and so, from a perennial philosophy perspective, um, perennial philosophers don't only believe that our neuroses and psychoses and mental health problems today are being generated by repressed desires or repressed trauma, but also because there's a part of us that wants to self actualize, that wants to know that part of us that's ocean. We can feel there's an aspect of what I am that I'm not able to get in touch with. And I find that very frustrating. And I don't know how to self actualize. And I don't know how to find meaning beyond that broadcast by the TV set. So, what should I do? And they're floundering around looking for meaning. So, that's a lot of what's driving it, is the desire for self actualization that's endemic to what we are as beings. And part of what's going on today is this psychedelic renaissance. After Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, more and more people are realizing, wow, maybe psychedelics are a way that I can self actualize. Now, I, as an old perennial philosopher with decades and decades of meditation experience, meditation and time spent in nature were my primary triggers. For some people, their art, music, love is a tremendous self transcendence experience. And so, uh, people in this psychedelic renaissance are having these experiences and looking for interpretations of them. So, I think that's a lot of what's creating this blossoming of interest right now. If I can just add on that for a moment, I recently was giving a talk, and I thought I was going to be speaking to about 20 people, and more than 50 people tried to jam into a room that could only accommodate about 25, and and we managed to make it work. But what I realized as I was talking was that a lot of people in the room were reporting these unitive mystical experiences of oneness. And so I asked them, how many people feel that you've had an experience like the ones I've been describing? And I would say, uh, 4/5 of everybody in the room raised their hand. And I had them look around at each other, and I saw in their faces, wow, it's not only me. I'm not alone in this grand search. There are other people who also realize there are things of great importance that I haven't been paying attention to, or that I need to pay more attention to.
In what ways has the landscape changed since Huxley's Perennial Philosophy first came out? And how does the Perennial Philosophy Reloaded provide new eyes?
Well, it provides new eyes by encouraging people to wake up to deeper dimensions of their own consciousness. And once they've had some experiences of expanded awareness, I think it's very, very difficult to, to go back, so to speak. You realize, oh my God, a door has opened. I see a direction for growth. I see experientially and undeniably that my consciousness is a variable and that I can wake up into more authentic layers of what I am and make deeper connections with the world around me. So that's what I mean by, and what Proust meant by new eyes that are so critical. His fellow Frenchman, uh, the phenomenologist, philosopher, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, once said, "Because we're present to a world, we're condemned to meaning." What he meant by that was, at some point very early in our development, 2 years old, we realize, wow, I have things I can control. I can tell my hand to move and it does. But I can tell the teddy bear sitting beside me to move and it doesn't. So there are things that are in my control, things that aren't. And what is my relationship on the individual level of my being with these other beings? So, what is my relationship to these others and to the world itself? I can't escape the fact that I have to come up with some kind of philosophy to base those interactions on. If you say, well, I'm not going to do it, okay, you can't not do it because those others, you're present to a world. So you're condemned to find meaning. So why not find a meaning that's meaningful and that serves you well and that serves the world well? Uh, and developing new eyes, expanding your consciousness is, from a perennial philosophy perspective, fundamental. Fundamental. You don't just need new ideas in your head. Uh, that's not enough. I mean, it helps, right? I mean, a better interpretation uh, gives us a platform for thoughts and actions also. But the experience is what perennial philosophers place a premium on.
So, Dana, maybe this leads to my next question, which is, does the universe want us to wake up?
Oh, that's a great, great, great question. I want us to wake up. Maybe you want us to wake up. We need to wake up. But there are perennial philosophers that believe that. There are perennial philosophers who are psychological perennialists who believe, well, it's really more that humans have this capacity to experience this oneness. And we know that it has therapeutic value, that people's behavior changes in a more positive direction. And that's enough for them. They don't want to make any ontological claims or grandiose claims. But there are also perennial philosophers who believe that, and this goes all the way back to Friedrich Schelling in German philosophy, that we are, so consciousness is cosmic, and consciousness is looking out through all of our eyeballs, and that biological evolution is actually a way that the universe is trying to generate a machine that can wake up to its own nature. And some of these perennialists believe that a human being is that. Rupert Spira comes to mind, that Michael Murphy, there's others, believe that the universe is trying to wake up to what it is in the context of us waking up to what we are. And that's quite interesting and exciting, theoretically speaking.
It's almost like it's a play. It's almost like a dance.
Yeah, yeah.
Or how do you see plant medicine technologies and perennial philosophy as connected, or perhaps even synergistically connected?
Well, like Huxley and like Houston Smith and all the early and most of the latter day perennialists, I too believe that plant medicines reliably can foster these kinds of experiences and occasion them. I mean, I've heard so many reports from so many people who will say, I was never a seeker, I was never really awake in any complex way until I had a plant medicine experience. And I've been trying to understand that experience. So I don't want to say that it's the only way to trigger such experiences. Back in the 60s and early 70s, when I was interested in psychedelics and the perennial philosophy, that was a time when I was a big Beatles fan, and the Beatles believed that through transcendental meditation, they could make the flashes of insight on psychedelics an abiding light, wake up into what some people term enlightenment. And I took that path and found a lot of value in meditation practice. And so there are lots of ways. Uh, the Romantics back in the late 18th and 19th century, they saw art and music and poetry as primary engines that awaken the mind and awaken the heart to what we're talking about. So I don't want people to think that I'm saying psychedelics are an exclusive way. But for many people, and I should also say, and not for all people, not all people will have a unitive experience on psychedelics, but they do reliably trigger these experiences, and I think that should be acknowledged.
Dana, could you talk about some of the more impactful or eye-opening messages that you have in this audiobook, Perennial Philosophy Reloaded? Or perhaps to put it another way, what could someone listening to your book stand to gain from this work?
I think what's going to happen for a lot of people that have just even a superficial attraction to this book is that a lot of people have these unitive experiences regularly, but they live in a culture that trains them to ignore them, or just, oh, that doesn't important, that's not practical. You've got to think about the mortgage, and you've got to think about the car payment, and you do have to think about the mortgage and the car payment. But if you lived in a culture that was also nourishing these unitive experiences and giving you a way to interpret them. I meet so many young people today who, for instance, through psychedelics, are having these experiences, but they don't have the words to interpret them in a meaningful way. And that's frustrating because the experience itself feels so profoundly meaningful to them. But what does it mean in human language? So this book, in only 120 pages, gives them a very, I set the book up in such a way that I'm answering primary philosophical human questions. Who are we? What are we doing here? What is this place where we wake up into every morning? So, what is the nature of reality? Uh, what is the meaning of life? Does life have meaning? I'm answering very basic questions through this lens of the perennial philosophy. So I think that is what they are going to primarily get. And for people who've been following the perennial philosophy in one form or another in my generation from the original crop of perennialists, they're going to find a lot of updating of the perspective and uh, nuancing of the perspective that I think they'll find very legitimating of uh, their own experience, over all these years.
I'd like to read an Emily Dickinson quote, if I could. She wrote, I am out with lanterns looking for myself. So my question to you is, how close have you come to your own inner mystic?
First, let me say I love Emily Dickinson. She was a New England transcendentalist influenced by Emerson, and there's a lot of synergy between the perennial philosophy and that perspective of New England transcendentalism. Uh, in my personal journey, from a very early age, I grew up in a fishing village here in Maine of only 700 people. And starting around the age of 8 or 9, I would go fishing by myself. in a brook behind our village. And my father told me, no matter how far back in the woods you go, if you never leave the brook, you can never get lost. You just follow it back into town. And out in those woods, I would have these amazing unitive experiences, and I had no words for them. But I also didn't see them as supernatural. I didn't see them as even unusual. I was a child. They were just what happened to me. And quite frankly, I think it happens to children a lot, and they're only discouraged from it as time goes on in our culture. But for myself, I realized as I would come back into town that not everybody was having those experiences, and yet I never stopped trying to understand what they were. And in university, I experimented with psychedelics and had them again, and so it's been a quest to not only understand those experiences, but to increase those experiences. And yes, I can say I've found my ways of becoming more of who I am. Not more of Dana, but more of what is beyond Dana. Not only the stars that are outside in the sky, but the stars and planets that are in that very vast, beautiful inner universe.
Amazing. Thank you. Um, this one is just for fun. Think elevator pitch. Could you describe in a couple of sentences your perfect setting to listen to the audiobook, The Perennial Philosophy Reloaded?
Oh, I would say like the perfect setting would be a quiet place in a backyard, a quiet place in the woods, someplace where you're sitting with the world all around you. The bees are buzzing, the birds are singing. You, you know, uh, Somebody's going to dislike me for saying this because they're going to be listening to it on their car system saying, I'm stuck in traffic. What is this guy talking about? But, I think if we understand what I'm trying to say in the book, then there's no separation between the sacred and profane. It's all sacred. It's all just one thing. And the separations of what you want to hate, what you want to love are stuck in your head. Uh, you know, I would say, like Thich Nhat Hanh would say, what's an opportunity here you're missing to open to something beautiful? I remember his story about people stop at stoplights and they feel stopped and they get very, very, very angry. But what they don't realize is here's a precious little moment you could see that, oh, thank you, stoplight. I have a moment to pull myself into the present moment and do a little mini meditation. I'm here, I'm in the world, and what an extraordinary, unbelievable experience it is to be an embodied being. So anywhere, I guess, is the best if your mind is open.
Beautiful. New eyes, new eyes. Let me ask you about the audiobook. Does it contain any bonus material?
It does. It does. So the audiobook contains an interview that Lisa did with me. We had a lot of fun doing that. This might be something that the listener will want to hear, which is that I really like her version of the audiobook, that I'm really pleased with how it came out.
Dana, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate your wonderful answers, and I'm excited for listeners to get a chance to hear this wonderful book, Perennial Philosophy Reloaded. So thank you so much.
I'll just say to people who are listening to it that are having these experiences and that this book resonates with, you're not alone out there. There are a lot of people having these experiences and they're waking up and they're coming together, and find your little branch of the Sangha.
The Perennial Philosophy Reloaded, a guide for the mystically inclined, is available now at all major audiobook retailers.